Hi, I'm Paul Garner. I'm here with Jose Rojas. We're both product managers in the identity division. We're here to talk to you about leveraging Microsoft Entra to counter token theft. The things we're going to talk through today include talking about the problem, what is it, how to apply a defense in depth framework. We're going to talk about identity protection, continuous access evaluation, token protection, and the internet access compliant network check. So token theft is emerging as a favored tactic among malicious actors, posing significant risks to organizations. It's true that compared with the scale of other credential-based attacks, it's still fairly uncommon, but it is growing. And the identity protection detections that Entra ID has are growing steadily. We can see growth in these kinds of attacks. It's worth remembering that token theft can only take place after a successful breach. So either on the device or on a connection between the device and a service. There has to be a breach through which an attacker can exfiltrate tokens. So what does a token theft look like? Here you see a standard authentication request going to an identity provider using the OAuth protocol. Once the request is satisfied, the application can use the token it's acquired to access a service or relying party. The typical attack patterns we see are either an adversary in the middle, an AATM attack, where an attacker uses some form of proxy and removes tokens from the network as they pass through the proxy. Second is some form of malware on the device, which can extract tokens from the device while they're on the device. Third is highly related to that, is some sort of malicious user activity that extracts tokens from their device and ships them off to an attacker. And then lastly, if server logs are breached and there are tokens lying around in server logs, they can be extracted from the logs of the relying party. So Microsoft's Entra ID is the forefront of this battle, offering a suite of features to mitigate these threats. How can you use these tools to reduce the risk of a damaging attack involving token theft? Top of the list is to minimize the risk of an attack that might result in token theft. The first line of defense is device management and compliance, and the use of strong phishing-resistant credentials. And between them, these provide an effective resistance to many of the known attack patterns. We're not going to cover this in any more detail here. So second to that, Entra provides tools in identity protection to respond when we detect anomalous token use. These detections drive up user risk, which can then be used for real-time response by continuous access evaluation and risk-based conditional access. Then the third area, which we're going to focus most on, are the new tools which can prevent the successful use of stolen tokens. Let's briefly talk about identity protection and risk-based conditional access first, and then move on to continuous access evaluation. Jose, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. So when it comes to the ability to detect stolen tokens, specifically the replay, identity protection through risk-based conditional access allows both the evaluation and the mitigation of some of these risks. When a number of signals are processed and result in either a risky sign-in or a risky user, and for the purposes of token replay, it would be a risky user, that elevated signal can be transmitted a number of ways. Let's look at this three-step process briefly. From the left, we're talking about heuristic detection, and among those heuristic detections, it includes the ability to detect some of the token replays when they happen. There's also expert-generated algorithms that are used, as well as end-user generation through your own feedback loops. Any one of these things feed to the key question is user risk detected. And then actions come in. All the way to the right, we then consider absolutely the automatic remediation, which includes both conditional access remediation at the point of authentication or re-authentication, as well as the continuous access evaluation piece that impacts the resource, and I'll say a little more about that in a few minutes. Obviously, we have the ability to send a signal additionally to Azure Monitor and Sentinel for your own monitoring, as well as routing those signals through your own third-party SIEMs. Now, let's take a closer look at continuous access evaluation. Think of it as enabling the resources, and in this example, enabling Exchange Online as one key resource, as being able to perform some of the checks that Entra ID already performs at the time of authentication. We make the resource providers smart. Not only smart, but real-time smart. In the diagram to the left, we consider a user accessing a CA-capable client, gets her token from the identity provider, quite normal. And after having that token, uses that token against the resource, in this example, perhaps to check email. It is at the time that that token is utilized to check email, refresh email, send messages, etc., that now the Exchange Online as the sample resource, is now able to perform incremental checks. Now, what CAE does, it communicates events, could be risk events or life cycle events, and communicates policies. I'll talk a little bit about both, right? But let's focus on this slide about the signal that is directly related to Entra identity protection, anomalous token detection. Should that detection occur, this signal will raise the user risk. This signal will be communicated to all the resources that are CAE capable, and those resources will now be able to not accept any of the next access requests at the data plane that would happen from the client. And now, there are other revocation events. We won't go into those, but there are several others that similarly revoke that token. At the time of revocation, it pushes the revocation to the client, forcing now the client to re-authenticate back with Entra ID, which results then in the very latest status of that account being used. Of course, if it was a user risk situation at the high level, it could very well deny the next token. Also, the other type of communication is policies. We'll talk about that in the next slide related to locations. So consider the conditional access location policies that you are probably already using. If not, you should. Now, that policy, for example, being able to say, hey, allow access only from IP ranges A and IP range B. That policy is pushed forward to the resource provider, again, the example Exchange Online. Now the Exchange Online resource is also aware of said policy and will similarly evaluate every access request from the client, again, back to refresh my email, send an email, and in that evaluation, detect the IP address that that client is coming from. The reason this directly affects and hopefully mitigates a token replay is because it is very likely that that token replay is happening from an IP address that you have not previously trusted. It really does depend on that. So conversely, if the access should happen from an allowed IP address, this won't do much for you. When that attacker from location C in this example with the stolen artifact, let's just say in this case an access token, while the access token is completely valid, that location it's accessing from is not in this example. Now, I want to say a little bit about the strict or not. And the reason this is important, and especially for those of you, many of you, who have complex routing between the address that goes from your client, say Outlook Mobile or Outlook in your Windows device, accessing the identity provider for authentication, could be IP address A, and the IP address that the resource provider actually sees from the client could be IP address B, or really a range of addresses B. In fact, we do detect different addresses between the two. And it is important that both of those sets of possible ranges are registered in the conditional access policy. However, if you are not able to trust both of those pathways equally or at the high level, then you should stick with what we call the CA strict location enforcement mode off. Why is that important? Because on CA strict location enforcement mode off, we are able to distinguish and say, hey, whereas the access for the token was from an allowed address, the access from the client to the resource provider is not an allowed IP address. However, at that point in time, what happens is the resource rejects that request, sends it back to CAE. CAE checks again that indeed there is a good address for that client, again, back to A, right? And then Entra ID will issue a token, this time a token that is a shorter-lived token, and it will allow the access to, in this case, to Exchange Online, but only on that condition. What strict location does, conversely, is not allow that access. So if A is the very strictest definition, if not A and B are both in the allowed path and it is detected by the resource, it will be rejected. Lastly, let's talk about where CAE is and it's not. So in this next slide, we then talk about the different resources that are CAE enabled. And we are talking from the left, major M365 resources. Importantly, if your own applications use these resources, you should also make your clients or applications CA capable. Upcoming Dynamics Power BI and Azure Resource Manager. And also the benefits of the signals are also being broadcast to Microsoft Entra private access and internet access. Back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Jose. So now we're going to talk about the newest feature set that we're developing in Microsoft Entra. It's called token protection. This is designed to restrict the use of authentication artifacts that can be stolen and then replayed from a device that's controlled by an attacker. The way we do this is to use bound tokens that are bound to the device, and they're bound using cryptography, using a binding key that's stored on the device. Once the token's bound, it can't be used without the binding key. This is called proof of possession, and it effectively means the token can only be used by an application that's running on the device the token was originally issued to. Applications need to switch to using bound tokens instead of the bearer tokens that are normally used, or the tokens that obviously can be stolen. So the way we ensure that the access to services is only carried out with the new bound tokens is through conditional access. We have a conditional access policy that can require that access to specific services is only done with bound tokens. But the result of that, of course, is that if a token is stolen, moved to a device that's controlled by the attacker, and then replayed to try and access cloud services, the conditional access policy blocks the use of that bearer token. So only protected tokens that are sourced from the device they were issued to can be used to access cloud services under the conditions of the policy. The technique that we've used for token protection in Entra ID protects against both off-device and on-device attack vectors, both tokens being stolen from the network and malware-based token theft. When we think about protecting tokens, we have to think about the different types of tokens in use in the process. We divide them into two categories. The first is sign-in sessions. These are the tokens that are used and evaluated by Entra ID in order to request access tokens to access the relying party. The refresh tokens, the sign-in sessions, they tend to be long-lived, they're renewable, and can be broadly scoped. So it can be used for access to a number of different resources. So these are the top priority to protect. We'll refer to these as sign-in sessions. We already have bound tokens that we use in Entra ID. The primary refresh token that's used on registered devices is bound to the device. And then for web applications, the cookie that's tied to the primary refresh token is bound to the device and is used as a bound token for web application access. So when you apply a policy in conditional access, you can require that bound tokens are the only tokens used in the context of access to a specific resource like Exchange or SharePoint. When an application is trying to use those services, for sign-in session, rather than use a standard refresh token that's a bearer token directly against Entra ID, the application now talks to the device broker, the broker that is shipped on the device, which uses the binding key that's in secure storage on the device and uses a bound token request to Entra ID. This ensures the refresh tokens that it would have used otherwise can't be stolen and replayed from elsewhere. Policy prevents the use of bearer refresh tokens. So if a malicious actor were to obtain a refresh token, a bearer refresh token, the policy would block their access and they would see a screen like this on the right. You should note that it also blocks a legitimate user if the application doesn't use the bound tokens. So if they're accessing a resource that's protected by the policy and they use an application that uses bearer refresh tokens, that application will be blocked under the policy. What we recommend is that you deploy first a policy using report-only mode in conditional access, and then this will allow you to check application compatibility and ensure that users won't be blocked when you actually enable the policy to enforce it. And what we recommend is that you go through and scope your policy. You identify users for whom you can apply a policy without affecting their productivity and gain the security benefit of doing so. So where are we with token protection? We have token protection for sign-in sessions on SharePoint, Exchange, and Team services. when accessed by Windows desktop applications. That's in public preview today. We hope to make that generally available early next year. Up next, we have support for Azure management scenarios. And also we'll be adding support for web applications accessing resources, M365 resources. We'll also next year add support for Mac, iOS, Android, and Linux clients. So there'll be cross-platform capabilities. Today, you can only scope a policy to Windows clients. You can check online for documentation and resources to learn more. While we're on the topic, we should mention the new compliant network check in Entra Internet Access, which provides an additional option to limit token replay. By ensuring that the user connects from a verified network connectivity and is compliant with your network security policies, requests from outside the compliance boundary are blocked. Other sessions will cover Entra Internet Access in more detail, but we want to point you to this useful tool in the arsenal. So in terms of what to go do, in order to prevent token replay, remember that the first line of defense is always device management and compliance and providing your users with strong multi-factor phishing resistant credentials. Jose.
Thank you, Paul. For continuous access evaluation, most of the continuous access evaluation happens without you having to do anything. It happens through first-party apps, particularly M365 applications and clients are well protected. However, there's a few things you can do to increase this protection. First, for your applications that use Microsoft APIs, it could be MS Graph, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online. Make sure you, and perhaps your vendors as well, make sure your applications that access those APIs become CA capable. Next, location policies. We mentioned briefly earlier how location policies impact this, but they require some work for you to maximize the effect. First, begin with using non-strict location enforcement. This will give you the most protection that you can. However, it has the limitation of the issue we talked about, the networks. So introduce strict location enforcement methodically, a few users at a time, testing across your user base so that you begin to observe what are the internet IP addresses that are being detected by the resource, and you can view this in the CA workbooks. So you will then be much more aware of how that traffic is perceived, not only by Entra ID, but by the resources. And methodically begin to add those IP ranges into your conditional access policy so that they are also protected. Always keep in mind that it works both at the point of authentication and the point of resource access, so they should be trusted. Paul?
For token protection, as I mentioned, their first feature for Windows native client to access to Office resources is now in public preview. It's deployable now and provides real security value. Most native applications are supported, and you can use conditional access in report-only mode to first evaluate your deployment and ensure that you can apply a policy without interrupting user access. I highly recommend reading the documentation. It will tell you what's compatible and where the issues might be. For your own applications, you can update them to use the latest MSAL libraries and make token requests using the broker, which will then use bounds tokens and will pass a policy for accessing underlying resources protected by that policy. And then lastly, watch out for upcoming previews that we have for cross-platform, for Azure management, etc. So thank you for watching. We'll look forward to seeing you use these features.
Automate the employee onboarding process with Microsoft Entra Identity Governance. The user identity lifecycle is a critical part of an organization's security posture, and if managed correctly, can have a positive impact on their users' productivity. By automating custom workflows to manage the user onboarding process, you can ensure new employees and those with job role changes are productive immediately and monitor the lifecycle, ensuring that access is removed as soon as employees leave the organization. In this series of demos, we'll identify and walk through some key scenarios highlighting how organizations can improve their security posture without impacting user productivity through automation with lifecycle workflows in Microsoft Entra Identity Governance. Human resources and IT departments both benefit from these innovations. For this demo, we'll walk through how IT admins can use lifecycle workflows to quickly configure built-in workflow templates for automating repetitive tasks and onboarding one, dozens, or even hundreds of employees at once. Let's see how this works. Normally, onboarding new employees requires the manual generating of a number of tickets for IT to process and a set of disconnected steps that IT has to complete. Often, the result is that the new employee is missing required access to apps, Microsoft Teams group memberships, SharePoint site permissions, and so on. Processing the service tickets and potentially tracking down erroneous or missing steps takes significant time and effort for IT admins. As a reminder, users can be auto-provisioned from HR systems like Workday, SuccessFactors, or other generic HR sources into Microsoft Entra using our provisioning service. Here's an example from Workday. We can see that users have already been created with the necessary attributes and were provisioned into Microsoft Entra. Here in the Entra portal, you can see Lisa Taylor's profile now exists in Microsoft Entra with the attributes successfully mapped from Workday, including her employee hire date. Now, I can easily create a custom workflow to run before an employee's start date using one of the built-in workflow templates. Lifecycle Workflows automatically detects users that meet the criteria of workflows so you can save time. I'll choose the pre-hire template, then I'll give it a name. And I can already see that it's set to run 7 days before the employee's hire date. The correct department is already set, so I'll just set the state attribute as an additional scoping mechanism. Next, I'll configure a few tasks from the set of built-in tasks. The Generate Temporary Access Pass and Send Email tasks are already available as part of the template. So I just need to select the marketing group. And then I want to use the built-in extensibility to create a ServiceNow ticket. Now I can review all my changes and enable the schedule and then create the workflow. While working to streamline the onboarding process, it's important to keep track of all these moving parts. Microsoft Entra makes it easy to onboard multiple employees at once. You saw me create a custom workflow in just a few steps that, based on the employee start date, generates a temporary access pass, sends an email to the new employee's manager, adds the employee to the marketing group, and creates a ServiceNow ticket using our built-in Logic Apps extensibility. Based on the tenant schedule, the workflow will automatically run in 1 hour and only for the marketing employees who are set to start in the next 7 days in Washington. This ensures access is only given to the intended users. I've also previously created a separate custom workflow to automate onboarding tasks for newly hired marketing employees. This workflow enables the user's account, adds them to the new employee onboarding team in Microsoft Teams, and sends a customized welcome email to the user with the Woodgrove branding, a link to the My Apps portal, where the new user can automatically gain access to the apps their role requires, and the new employee support team on CC. This ensures that the new hire has everything they need to be productive on day one. By setting up lifecycle workflows using the pre-hire template, I've automated the onboarding process so that new employees are ready to go on their first day, removed the possibility of human error granting access inappropriate for the new employees' roles, and freed time in the IT staff for other higher value work.